The great ship moved through the darkness of space like a golden blade cutting through black water. And Ambassador Cathralen stood at the observation window with his forearms folded behind his back as he watched the small blue planet grow larger in the distance. He had served the Valorian hegemony for 300 years. And in that time, he had brought 60 different species into the Empire's warm embrace. But he had never seen a world quite like this one before Earth. The humans called it, and Cathralen found the name. Almost charming in its simplicity, the hegemony had discovered these creatures only 5 years ago, when one of their deep space probes had picked up strange radio signals coming from an unremarkable yellow star on the edge of the galaxy. And since then the Imperial Council had been watching them with growing interest. They were young, these humans, barely a century into true space travel, and yet they had already spread across their solar system like weeds growing through cracks in stone. Cathralen turned away from the window and walked through the gleaming corridors of the Eternal Accord, the greatest diplomatic vessel in the hegemony's fleet. And everywhere he looked, he saw the symbols of 12,000 years of galactic dominance. The walls were covered in the flags of 400 star systems, each one representing a species that had accepted the hegemony's offer of protection and prosperity. And soon there would be one more flag hanging among them. He was certain of this because no species had ever refused the ship's captain. A tall Valorian female named Sithara met him at the bridge with a look of mild confusion on her blue-scaled face. "Ambassador," she said with a small bow of her head, "our sensors are detecting something unusual." Cathralen raised one of his eye ridges in question. "Show me." The main screen flickered to life, and what Cathralen saw made him take a step backward in surprise. The human solar system was not the primitive collection of scattered colonies he had expected to find, but instead it was a fortress bristling with weapons and activity defense platforms orbited every major body. Their weapons arrays pointed outward at the stars, and massive mining operations carved into the asteroids with industrial efficiency that seemed impossible for such a young species. Ships moved between the planets in organized patterns. Warships and cargo vessels and exploration craft, all of them bearing the same symbol of a blue and green circle against a black background. "This cannot be right," Cathralen said slowly. "Our intelligence suggested they were barely capable of interplanetary travel." Sithara shrugged her shoulders in the way her people did when they had no answers to give. "Perhaps they developed faster than we expected." The ambassador studied the screen for a long moment, and then he straightened his formal robes and put on his most diplomatic smile. "No matter," he said with confidence he did not entirely feel. "They are still primitives compared to the hegemony, and they will be grateful for what we offer them." The Eternal Accord crossed into the inner solar system and was immediately surrounded by a dozen human warships that appeared as if from nowhere. Cathralen was impressed despite himself, for the ships were crude things compared to Valorian vessels, all sharp angles and exposed weapons. But they moved with a speed and coordination that spoke of excellent training. The communication request came through, and the ambassador accepted it with a wave of his hand. The face that appeared on the screen belonged to a human female with dark skin and silver hair pulled back from her face in a severe style, and her eyes held the kind of cold calculation that Cathralen had learned to respect in his centuries of diplomacy. "Unidentified vessel," she said in a voice that held no fear at all. "You have entered United Earth Coalition space without permission. State your intentions or be escorted out." Cathralen bowed deeply, all four of his arms sweeping outward in the traditional gesture of peaceful greeting. "I am Ambassador Cathralen of the Valorian hegemony," he said in his warmest voice, "and I come bearing gifts of friendship and an offer that will change your species' destiny forever." The woman's expression did not change even slightly. "I am Admiral Sarah Chun of the UEC Defense Fleet," she replied. and you will follow our ships to the diplomatic station on Luna. Any deviation from the assigned course will be considered a hostile act." The communication ended without another word, and Catherlin found himself staring at a blank screen with his mouth hanging open in shock. In 300 years, no one had ever spoken to him like that. The journey to the lunar station took several hours, and during that time the ambassador reviewed everything the hegemony knew about humanity. They were a strange species. These humans, prone to violence against each other in ways that seemed almost insane. And yet they had somehow managed to unite their world and reach for the stars. Their history was a long record of wars and suffering, of empires rising and falling, of countless millions dying for causes that were forgotten within a generation. And yet they kept going, kept building, kept reaching for something better. Catherlin found it all very confusing. The diplomatic station was a large structure built into the gray rock of Earth's moon. And when the ambassador stepped off his ship, he was met by a delegation of humans in formal clothing. At their head stood a woman he recognized from the intelligence files, Secretary General Amara Okonkwo, the leader of the United Earth Coalition and the most powerful human alive. She was tall for her species, with skin the color of rich earth and eyes that seemed to look right through him. "Ambassador Catherlin," she said with a small nod of her head. "Welcome to humanity." The formal meeting took place in a large conference room with windows that looked out over the gray lunar surface. And Catherlin delivered his offer with all the skill and grace that 3 centuries of experience had given him. He spoke of the hegemony's long history, of the peace and prosperity that came from joining such a powerful alliance, and of the dangers that lurked in the dark spaces between the stars. He offered them technology beyond their wildest dreams, access to trade routes spanning the galaxy, protection from hostile species, and a seat in the Imperial Congress where their voice would be heard among the stars. In exchange, humanity would simply need to recognize the High Sovereign as their ultimate authority, contribute soldiers to the Imperial fleet when called upon, and allow Valorian advisors to guide their expansion into the galaxy. It was a generous offer, far more generous than most species received, and Catherlin fully expected the humans to accept it with gratitude and joy. But when he finished speaking, Secretary General Okonkwo simply looked at him with those deep, unreadable eyes. And then she turned to the other humans at the table and had a quiet conversation in their own language. After several minutes, she turned back to face the ambassador. "We appreciate you coming all this way," she said in a tone that was polite but held no warmth. "And we understand this offer is given in good faith." Catherlin smiled and prepared to discuss the formalities of the treaty. "However," Okonkwo continued, and the ambassador's smile froze on his face, "we will need to discuss this matter among ourselves before we can give you an answer." The room went very quiet. "Discuss it," Catherlin repeated, certain he had misheard something. "Yes," the Secretary General said calmly. "This is a significant decision that will affect all of humanity, and we do not make such choices lightly. We will be in touch." The ambassador opened his mouth and then closed it again, completely at a loss for words. In 12,000 years of galactic history, no species had ever asked for time to think about joining the hegemony. They simply said yes, because saying no was unthinkable. He looked around the table at the human faces, searching for some sign that this was a joke or a negotiating tactic. But all he saw was calm determination. "How long?" he managed to ask. "Will you need?" Secretary General Okonkwo stood up from her chair, signaling that the meeting was over. "As long as it takes," she said simply. And then she walked out of the room without looking back. Ambassador Catherlin stood alone in the conference room for a long time, staring at the door through which the humans had departed. And for the first time in 300 years, he had absolutely no idea what to do next. 3 weeks passed on the lunar station, and Ambassador Kethrelin felt like he was slowly losing his mind. Every day, he sent messages to the United Earth Coalition asking for updates. And every day he received the same polite response telling him that discussions were ongoing and that they would contact him when a decision had been reached. He paced the halls of his ship like a caged animal, his forearms constantly moving in gestures of frustration. And his staff began to avoid him whenever possible. The messages from home did not help his mood at all. The High Council wanted answers. The Imperial Congress wanted answers. And even the High Sovereign herself had sent a personal inquiry asking why the integration of this primitive species was taking so long. Kethrelin had no answers to give them. He had tried to explain that the humans were behaving in ways that made no sense, that they were treating the greatest offer in their history as if it were a business proposal that needed careful review. But no one back home could understand what he was describing. Species did not need to think about joining the hegemony, because joining the hegemony was obviously the right choice. It was like needing to think about whether water was wet on the 23rd day. Admiral Chun contacted the Eternal Accord with a message that made Kethrelin's heart beat faster in his chest. The humans had reached a decision, and Secretary General Okonkwo wanted to meet the ambassador. Spent hours preparing for this meeting, rehearsing his acceptance speech in front of the mirror, practicing the formal gestures that would seal the treaty, and imagining how pleased the High Sovereign would be when he brought humanity into the fold. He arrived at the conference room with a smile on his face and confidence in his step. Secretary General Okonkwo was already there, sitting at the head of the table with several advisors at her sides, and her expression was as unreadable as it had been during their first meeting. Kethrelin took his seat and spread his arms in a gesture of openness and welcome. "I understand you have reached a decision," he said warmly, "and I am honored to be here to receive humanity's acceptance into the Valorian hegemony." Okonkwo looked at him for a long moment, and something in her eyes made the ambassador's confidence begin to waver. "We have indeed reached a decision," she said slowly, "and I want you to understand that this decision was not made lightly. We debated in every council chamber on every world where humans live, and the result was nearly unanimous." Kethrelin leaned forward eagerly. "And that result is?" "We decline." The word hung in the air like a physical thing, and Kethrelin was certain he had misheard. "I am sorry," he said carefully. "I do not think I understood you correctly." "You understood perfectly," Okonkwo replied calmly. "Humanity declines your offer of membership in the Valorian hegemony. All of it, every part." The ambassador's forearms fell limply to his sides, and he felt a strange numbness spreading through his body. "But that is impossible," he whispered. "No one refuses the hegemony." The Secretary General folded her hands on the table in front of her, and when she spoke, her voice was firm but not unkind. "We have studied your offer very carefully, Ambassador, and while we appreciate the benefits you describe, we cannot accept the conditions that come with them." Kethrelin shook his head in confusion. What conditions could possibly be objectionable? "We offer you protection from every threat in the galaxy, in exchange for soldiers from our worlds to fight in your wars," Okonkwo replied. "Wars that we did not choose and do not understand. We offer you technology that would advance your civilization by centuries, in exchange for Valorian advisors who would have authority over our expansion," she countered. "Authority that would make them the true masters of humanity's future. We offer you a seat in the Imperial Congress, where your voice would be heard among the stars. A seat where we would speak only to agree with decisions already made," the Secretary General said quietly. "A voice that carries no real power and serves only to give the appearance of choice." Kethrelin stood up so quickly that his chair fell over behind him. "You do not understand what you are refusing," he shouted, losing his diplomatic composure for the first time in centuries. The galaxy is a dangerous place filled with threats you cannot imagine. There are species out there that would destroy your entire civilization without a second thought. And you think you can survive alone? Okonkwo did not flinch at his outburst, and her calm made him feel foolish and small. We know the galaxy is dangerous, she said evenly. We have read your own records of the wars and disasters and extinctions that fill galactic history. But we also noticed something interesting in those records. And what is that? Every species that was destroyed while under the protection of a larger power. They had given up their own defenses in exchange for promises, and when those promises failed, they had nothing left to save themselves. The ambassador had no response to this, because he knew it was true. Humanity has survived terrible things, Okonkwo continued. We have survived ice ages and plagues and famines. We have survived wars that killed millions and disasters that should have ended us a dozen times over. But do you know what we have never survived? Cathrellan shook his head silently. We have never survived surrendering our freedom to another power, she said with a small smile that held no joy. Every empire we built eventually fell. Every time we bowed to a conqueror, we eventually rose up and threw them out. It is in our nature to resist, to fight, to refuse to be ruled by anyone but ourselves. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the blue and green bowl of Earth hanging in the black sky. We have survived ourselves. Ambassador, she said quietly, do you have any idea how rare that is? We came within minutes of destroying our own world with nuclear fire. Not once, but several times. And somehow we pulled back from the edge each time. She turned to face him again. A species that can survive its own worst impulses does not need your protection. What we need is to be left alone to find our own path among the stars. Cathrellan felt something he had never experienced before in all his years of diplomacy. Complete and utter defeat. The High Council will not accept this, he said weakly. They will see your refusal as an insult. That is not our concern, Okonkwo replied simply. We are not refusing because we wish to insult you. We are refusing because we cannot be what you want us to be. Humanity will not bow to any sovereign. We will not send our children to fight in foreign wars. And we will not let anyone else decide our destiny. Then you will stand alone against the darkness of space, the ambassador said bitterly. And when the threats come, as they surely will, you will have no one to help you. The Secretary General smiled again. And this time there was genuine warmth in it. We have always stood alone, Ambassador. Even when we were divided into 1,000 nations fighting each other for scraps of land, we were still alone on a little world with no one to help us, and we survived. We thrived. We reached the stars. She extended her hand in the human gesture of farewell. Tell your High Council that humanity is grateful for the offer. But we must decline. We wish the hegemony well, and we hope that we can find other ways to work together as equals. But we will never be your subjects. Cathrellan did not take her hand. He turned and walked out of the conference room in a daze, his mind spinning with questions he could not answer and fears he could not name. How was he going to explain this to the High Sovereign? How was he going to tell the Imperial Congress that a species barely a century into space travel had looked at the greatest power in the galaxy and said no? He did not know, and for the first time in his very long life, Ambassador Cathrellan was afraid. The journey back to Valorian space took several weeks, and during that time, the ambassador tried to compose his report 100 different times. Each version sounded worse than the last, because there was no way to make this story sound good. He had been sent to bring a new species into the hegemony, and he had failed completely when he finally stood before the High Council. His report was met with stunned silence. The ancient Valorians who ruled the empire looked at each other with expressions of confusion and disbelief. And when they finally spoke, their voices were filled with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. This has never happened before, the eldest of them said slowly. In 12,000 years, no species has ever refused us. Cathrelin bowed his head in shame. I know. My lord, I do not understand it myself. But the humans were very clear in their decision. Then they must be made to understand their mistake. Another council member said coldly, we will send more diplomats. We will offer better terms. And if that fails, we will show them what happens to species that refuse the hegemony's kindness. The ambassador felt a chill run down his spine. My lords, he said, carefully, I would advise caution. These humans are not like other species I have dealt with. There is something in them that I have never seen before. Something that makes me think they would rather burn than bend. But the council was not listening. They were already making plans, already discussing strategies, already deciding how to bring these stubborn primitives to heel and deepen his hearts. Cathrelin knew that they were making a terrible mistake. 50 years passed, and the Valorian hegemony learned what it meant to be frustrated. The High Council sent diplomat after diplomat to Earth, each one more senior and more skilled than the last. And each one returned with the same answer no. They offered better terms, more generous trade deals, reduced obligations, and even promised humanity complete autonomy over their internal affairs. But the humans just smiled politely and declined when diplomacy failed. The council tried pressure. They declared the space around human territory to be restricted, cutting off the young species from the major trade routes that connected the galaxy. And they expected the humans to come crawling back within a year, desperate for the resources and technology they could only get from hegemony space. But the humans did not come crawling back instead. They did something that no one had anticipated. They went around human ships, began appearing in the distant corners of the galaxy where the hegemony's control was weakest, making contact with minor species who lived outside the Empire's protection, offering trade and friendship without any of the strings that came with Valorian membership. These small civilizations had never been important enough for the hegemony to bother with. But now they suddenly had access to human technology and human goods. And they were more than happy to share what they had in return within a decade. Humanity had built a network of trading partners that stretched across the outer rim of the galaxy. And the hegemony's trade restrictions had become meaningless. The High Council was furious if they could not pressure humanity economically. They decided they would try other methods. Intelligence operatives were sent to the human colonies, where they found discontented groups who were unhappy with the United Earth Coalition's centralized government on Mars. There were settlers who wanted independence from Earth on Titan. There were separatists who believed their frozen moon should be its own nation on the asteroid mining stations. There were workers who felt exploited by the corporations that ran the van. Operations Valorian agents made contact with all of these groups, offering them money and weapons and promises of support, encouraging them to rise up against the coalition and weaken humanity from within for a while. It seemed like the plan might work. The Mars Liberation Front grew from a small protest movement into an armed militia. And when they seized control of 3 major domes and declared independence, the hegemony watched with satisfaction. But their satisfaction did not last long. The coalition's response was swift and brutal in a way that shocked even the Valorians within 48 hours. Coalition Marines had retaken all 3 domes, and the leaders of the Liberation Front were standing trial for treason. There were no long negotiations, no attempts at peaceful resolution, just overwhelming force applied with terrible precision. And then the humans did something even more unexpected. They released all of the evidence they had gathered during the conflict, broadcasting it across every frequency they could reach. And that evidence showed exactly how the Valorian hegemony had funded and armed the separatists. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as human officials laid out the entire operation in calm, clear terms. naming names and showing documents and leaving no room for doubt. The embarrassment was total and complete. In the Imperial Congress, representatives from 100 species stood up to demand answers, asking how the mighty hegemony could stoop to such tactics against a species that had done nothing but refuse a diplomatic offer. The High Council had no good answers to give them. For the first time in thousands of years, other species were openly questioning the hegemony's honor, and the humans had done it without firing a single shot at a Valorian target. The Warhawks in the council began to speak more loudly about military solutions, arguing that the only way to restore the Empire's reputation was to crush these upstart humans once and for all. But when the military commanders brought their assessments to the council, the news was not encouraging. In 50 years of contact, humanity had changed in ways that defied all predictions. They had reverse-engineered Valorian shield technology from captured smuggler vessels, improving on the original designs in ways that hegemony scientists could not fully understand. They had developed weapons that were completely new, energy systems that operated on principles the hegemony had never explored, and ship designs that sacrificed comfort and elegance for raw speed and firepower. Their fleet was no longer the collection of crude vessels that Ambassador Kethralin had observed on his first visit, but a genuine military force that had been built with one purpose in mind: fighting enemies who were technologically superior. And perhaps most disturbing of all, humanity had not stopped expanding. They now controlled 30 star systems, with colonies on worlds that ranged from frozen ice balls to scorching deserts. And on every one of those worlds, they had built defenses that would make any invasion enormously costly. We could defeat them, the Supreme Commander admitted to the High Council in a closed session. But the price would be very high. We would lose thousands of ships and millions of soldiers. And even then, we might not be able to hold the territory we conquered. Why not? Demanded one of the council members. Because humans do not surrender. The commander replied grimly. Every war they have ever fought has shown this. They will fight to the last soldier, the last civilian, the last child old enough to hold a weapon, and even if we destroyed their fleets and occupied their worlds, we would face an endless insurgency that would drain our resources for centuries. The council fell silent as they considered this. They had conquered hundreds of species over the millennia, but none of those conquests had been like this. Most species surrendered when they realized they could not win, choosing survival over destruction. And those that did fight were usually defeated within a few years. But humans were different. Their history was filled with examples of hopeless resistance, of small groups fighting against overwhelming odds for years or decades or even generations. And the idea of occupying 30 human worlds filled with billions of people who would never stop fighting was terrifying even to think about. There is another concern, the intelligence chief said quietly, and everyone turned to look at her. The humans have not been idle in their diplomacy. They have been talking to other species, not just the minor civilizations on the outer rim, but also some of our own member worlds. A wave of alarm swept through the council. Which worlds? The eldest council member demanded. Several dozen. At least, the intelligence chief replied. Species who joined the hegemony long ago, but have never been truly happy under our rule. Species who pay their tributes and send their soldiers, but dream of something more. The humans have been telling them that there is another way, that they do not have to be subjects of any empire. And some of them are listening. This was the nightmare scenario that the hegemony had always feared. An empire held together by force and economic pressure could survive challenges from outside. But if the member worlds began to question their membership, the whole structure could collapse like a house built on sand. The humans must be stopped, one council member said firmly, before they infect the entire galaxy with their ideas of independence. And how do you propose we stop them? Another asked bitterly. We have tried diplomacy, and they refused. We have tried pressure, and they went around us. We have tried subversion, and they exposed us. We have tried threats, and they built bigger weapons. What else is there? No one had an answer for 50 years. The Valorian hegemony had tried everything in their considerable arsenal to bring humanity into line. And they had failed at every turn. These strange, stubborn, impossible creatures had taken everything the greatest power in the galaxy could throw at them and had only grown stronger in the darkest corners of their minds. Some members of the council were beginning to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. All those years ago, perhaps they should have left the humans alone from the very beginning. Perhaps they should have recognized that there are some species that simply cannot be controlled. But it was too late for such thoughts. Now the confrontation between humanity and the hegemony had taken on a momentum of its own, and neither side could see a way to back down without losing everything they had built. The galaxy held its breath and waited to see what would happen next, and on 30 human worlds, ordinary people went about their daily lives, raising their children and building their homes and looking up at the stars. With the same determination that had carried their species from caves to space, they did not ask for this conflict. But they would not run from it either. They were human, and humans did not surrender. Not ever. The message arrived without warning on a quiet morning in the Imperial Palace. And when the High Council read its contents, they could not believe what they were seeing. High Sovereign Valeth the Ninth, Empress of the Valorian hegemony and ruler of 400 star systems, had announced that she would personally travel to human space to meet with their leader in 12,000 years of galactic history. No High Sovereign had ever left Valorian territory to negotiate with a species that had not already submitted to imperial authority. The council members rushed to the throne room to argue against this decision, warning of the dangers and the loss of prestige. But the Empress silenced them with a single look from her ancient eyes. I have watched this situation develop for 50 years, she said in a voice that carried the weight of millennia. And I have seen my council fail at every attempt to resolve it. Now I will see these humans for myself and learn what makes them so different from every other species we have encountered. No one dared to argue further. The Imperial flagship, the Eternal Glory, was the largest vessel in the hegemony's fleet. A floating palace of crystal and gold that had been home to emperors and empresses for thousands of years. It departed from the home world with an escort of 200 warships, a display of power that was meant to remind the humans of exactly who they were dealing with. But when the fleet arrived at the edge of human space, they found a welcome that matched their own show of force. 200 human warships waited at the border, their weapons powered down but clearly visible. And behind them hung something that made even the hardened Valorian commanders gasp in surprise: a space station, the size of a small moon, bristling with defense platforms and sensor arrays. A fortress that had not existed the last time hegemony scouts had surveyed this region. The humans had built it in less than 5 years, and it could probably hold off the entire hegemony fleet for months. The Empress observed all of this from her throne room aboard the Eternal Glory, and she felt something she had not experienced in a very long time: genuine curiosity. The meeting was arranged to take place on a neutral station in the space between the two fleets, a small diplomatic facility that belonged to neither Sid Vavaleth Ix walked to the meeting room with only 2 guards at her sides, her long robes trailing behind her on the polished floor. And when she entered the chamber, she found the human leader already waiting for her. Secretary General Chen Weilin was an old man by human standards, his hair white as snow and his face lined with the marks of many years. But his eyes were sharp and clear, and they met the Empress's gaze without flinching. "High Sovereign," he said with a small bow that was respectful but not submissive, "thank you for making this journey. Humanity is honored by your presence." Valeth took her seat across from him and studied his face with the skill of someone who had been reading people for centuries. "I have ruled this empire for 400 years," she said slowly. "And in all that time, I have never seen a species behave as yours has. You refuse our friendship. You resist our pressure. You seem determined to stand alone against an entire galaxy, and I cannot understand why." Chine smiled, and there was something sad in that smile that the Empress had not expected. "Perhaps that is because you have never met a species like us before," he replied. "We are not what we seem, High Sovereign, and the reasons for our choices go deeper than you might imagine." "Then explain it to me," Valeth said, leaning forward with genuine interest. "I did not come all this way for empty words. Tell me the truth about humanity." The old man was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. And when he spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of history. "How much do you know about human history, High Sovereign?" "I know the basic facts," Valeth replied. "Your species evolved on Earth approximately 300,000 years ago. You developed civilization roughly 10,000 years ago. And you achieved space travel in the last few centuries. You have fought many wars among yourselves, far more than most species. And you came close to destroying your own world on several occasions." Chan nodded slowly. "All of that is true. But those facts do not tell the whole story. Let me ask you a question. In all your millennia of ruling this empire, have you ever had to fight for your freedom?" The Empress frowned at this strange question. "The Valorians have always been free. We built the hegemony ourselves. No one has ever conquered us." "Then you cannot understand what it means to be human," Chan said quietly. "Because our entire history is the story of people fighting for their freedom, over and over again, generation after generation. Never stopping, never giving up, no matter how hopeless the cause seemed." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the stars. "We have been slaves and masters, conquered and conquerors. We have built empires that stretched across continents and watched them crumble to dust. We have bowed to kings and emperors and gods, and every single time, someone eventually rose up and said, 'No.' He turned back to face the Empress. That word is written into our very souls. High Sovereign, the word no is the most powerful word in human history. It has started revolutions and ended tyrannies. It has sent armies to their deaths and changed the course of civilizations. When everything else is taken from us, we still have that one word. And we will not give it up for anything." Valeth felt something shift in her understanding as she listened to his words. "You are not refusing us because you think you can win," she said slowly. "You are refusing us because you cannot do otherwise. It is in your nature." "Yes," Chen agreed. "We know that your empire is stronger than us. We know that if you truly wanted to destroy us, you probably could. But we also know that we cannot be what you want us to be. We cannot kneel. We cannot serve. We cannot surrender our freedom to any power, no matter how benevolent it claims to be." "But why?" the Empress asked, and there was almost a pleading note in her voice now. "Why is freedom so important that you would risk everything for it? What good is freedom if you are dead?" The old man walked back to his chair and sat down heavily. And for a moment, he looked every one of his many years. "Let me tell you a story," he said. "A true story from our history. There was once a nation called Sparta, a small city surrounded by enemies, and in one of their wars they faced an army of over 1 million soldiers, the largest military force the world had ever seen. They knew they could not win. They knew they would probably all die. But 300 of their warriors went out to face that army anyway." He paused, and his eyes seemed to look through the Empress to something far away. "They held a narrow pass for 3 days, killing thousands of enemies before they were finally overwhelmed. And when their king was asked why he was fighting when there was no hope of victory, he said that he would rather die on his feet than live on his knees." Valeth was silent. Absorbing this story, that spirit never left us, Chan continued. It has taken many forms over the centuries, but it is always there. The belief that freedom is worth dying for, that a life without liberty is not truly a life at all. Your hegemony offers us safety and comfort and prosperity, but the price is our soul. And that is a price we cannot pay. The Empress sat back in her chair and looked at this strange old creature with new eyes. She had ruled for 400 years and met thousands of species, but she had never encountered anything like this before. You would rather burn than bow, she said softly, echoing words that Ambassador Kethralin had spoken so long ago. Yes, Chun replied simply. We would, and not just our leaders or our soldiers, but our farmers and teachers and children. Every single human carries this fire inside them, and nothing you can do will ever put it out. A long silence fell over the room as the ruler of the greatest empire in galactic history sat face to face with a representative of one of the youngest species in space. And for once, it was the ancient power that had nothing to say. Finally, Valith Ix rose from her chair. I came here hoping to find a way to bring your people into the hegemony, she said. But I see now that such a thing is impossible. You are not refusing us out of pride or ignorance. You are refusing us because you have no choice. It is what you are. Chum stood as well and met her eyes. Will there be war then? The Empress considered the question carefully before answering. I do not know, she admitted. There are many in my council who believe that war is the only option, that we cannot allow a species like yours to exist outside our control. They fear what you represent, the idea that there is another way to live, and they may eventually have their way. She paused at the door and looked back at him. But I will tell you this, Secretary General, I have seen many species rise and fall over my long life, and the ones who survived were the ones who knew when to fight and when to bend. You humans seem to know only how to fight, and I wonder if that will be your salvation or your destruction. Perhaps both, Chun replied with a small smile. That seems to be our way. The Empress nodded once and walked out of the room, leaving the old man alone with his thoughts and the weight of his species, future on his shoulders. The journey back to Valorian space was quiet, and the Empress spent most of it in her private chambers, thinking about everything she had learned for the first time in her long reign. She was uncertain about the future. She had always believed that the hegemony's way was the right way, that bringing species under imperial protection was a gift that any reasonable civilization would accept, but the humans had shown her asterisk when Empress Valith IX returned to the hegemony and addressed the High Council. Her words shocked everyone who heard them. We will leave the humans alone, she declared from her throne, her voice carrying absolute authority. There will be no war, no more attempts at integration, no more pressure or subversion. We will recognize their territory and maintain peaceful relations. And that is my final word on the matter. The council erupted in protest war. Hawks demanded to know why the hegemony should bow to a species of primitives. Strategists warned that allowing humanity to grow unchecked would threaten imperial security. And traditionalists argued that no species had ever been allowed to refuse the hegemony without consequences. But the Empress simply waited until the noise died down. And then she spoke again. I have met these humans, she said slowly. I have looked into their eyes and heard their words. And I tell you now that they are not like any species we have ever encountered before. They do not want war with us, but they will fight one if we force them to. And that war would not end the way our generals predict. She stood up from her throne and walked down the steps to stand among her council, something she had never done before in 400 years of rule. The humans would not surrender even if we conquered every one of their worlds. She continued. They would fight us in the streets, in the fields, in the mountains. They would teach their children to hate us and their grandchildren after them. And we would spend the next 1,000 years trying to hold territory that would never truly be ours. The council fell silent as they listened to their empress speak with a passion they had never heard from her before. But more than that, Valeth said, "I have come to believe that the humans may be right. They have shown the galaxy that there is another way to exist, a way that does not require bowing to a greater power. And that idea is more dangerous to us than any fleet they could build." Dangerous? How? One council member asked. "Because other species are watching," the Empress replied. "Species who have been part of our hegemony for millennia, who have always done what we asked because they believed they had no choice. Now they see these humans standing alone against the greatest empire in history, and they are beginning to wonder if they could do the same." She looked around the room at the faces of her advisors, seeing understanding dawn in some eyes and stubborn resistance in others. "If we go to war with humanity and win, we might destroy them, but we will also prove that their ideas are worth dying for. And every species in our empire who has ever dreamed of freedom will remember their sacrifice forever. But if we leave them alone, if we show that we can coexist with those who choose a different path, then perhaps we can survive this challenge to our way of life." The debate continued for many days after that. But in the end, the Empress's will prevailed. A treaty was signed between the Valorian hegemony and the United Earth Coalition, recognizing each other's territories and establishing peaceful relations. And for the first time in 12,000 years, the hegemony officially acknowledged that there was a power in the galaxy that existed outside their control. The news spread across the stars like wildfire, and the reaction was everything the Empress had predicted on hundreds of worlds. Species who had spent centuries as loyal subjects of the hegemony suddenly began asking questions they had never dared to ask before. Why? Did they have to send soldiers to fight in imperial wars? Why did they have to pay tributes to a distant throne? Why did they have to accept Valorian oversight of their own affairs? The answers they received were the same answers that had satisfied their ancestors for generations, because the hegemony protected them, because the hegemony brought them prosperity, because there was no other way to survive in a dangerous galaxy. But now there was another way, and everyone could see it. The humans had shown that a species could stand alone, could defend itself, could build its own future without bowing to any emperor, and slowly, quietly, the galaxy began to change over the following decades. The Valorian hegemony evolved in ways that would have been unthinkable before humanity arrived on the scene. The High Council was forced to grant more autonomy to member worlds, to reduce the obligations required of subject species, to listen to voices that had been ignored for millennia. Some species took this as an opportunity to negotiate better terms within the empire, securing rights and freedoms that their ancestors had never dreamed of. Others went further. A dozen species officially left the hegemony during this period, declaring independence and establishing their own governments. And while some of these attempts failed, enough succeeded that the galaxy could no longer pretend the empire was the only option. Many of these newly independent species looked to humanity for guidance, seeking trade agreements and mutual defense pacts and the wisdom of a people who had walked this path before them. The humans accepted these requests with careful humility, never claiming to have all the answers but always willing to share what they had learned. And so a new power began to rise in the galaxy. Not an empire, but something different. A loose confederation of free species who had chosen to stand together without surrendering their sovereignty to any central authority. They called it the Terran Confederation, though it included species from 100 worlds, because it was humanity that had shown them the way. The hegemony and the PEZ Confederation maintained an uneasy peace over the years that followed, their borders fixed and their diplomats always talking. And while there were tensions and crises and moments when war seemed inevitable, somehow they always pulled back from the edge. Perhaps both sides understood that a war between them would destroy everything they had built. Perhaps they had learned that there was room in the galaxy for more than one way of life, or perhaps they simply respected each other too much to throw everything away over pride and fear. In the great halls of the Imperial Congress, a new saying began to spread among the younger species, those who had grown up in this new era and could not remember a time when the hegemony's word was absolute law. The Valorians taught us how to survive, they would say to each other. But the humans taught us we could choose not to kneel. The words were never spoken publicly, never recorded in official documents, but everyone knew them. And on Earth, the blue and green world that had started it all, monuments stood in every major city to honor those who had first said no to the greatest power in the galaxy. Names of Secretary General Amara Okonkwo and Secretary General Chen Weilin were taught to every child, alongside the names of all the other humans throughout history who had stood up against impossible odds and refused to surrender their freedom. The message of those monuments was simple. This is who we are. This is what we believe, and we will never forget. A century after first contact, humanity had grown into something their ancestors could never have imagined. They controlled over 100 star systems. Their technology had advanced to match, and in some areas exceed, the hegemonies, and their influence reached into every corner of the galaxy. But they had not become an empire themselves. They remained a confederation, a union of free worlds bound together by choice rather than force. And they welcomed any species that wanted to join them as equals rather than subjects. This was perhaps their greatest achievement. They had proven that power did not require domination, that strength did not require submission, that it was possible to build something great without crushing the freedom of others. And somewhere out in the black void between galaxies, human ships pushed ever outward into the unknown, carrying explorers and scientists and dreamers who wanted to see what lay beyond the next star. They answered to no empire, no sovereign, no master, but themselves. They were human, and they had never forgotten the word that had brought them this far. No, it was the most powerful word in any language, the word that had started revolutions and ended tyrannies, the word that had brought them from caves to the stars. And as long as there were humans in the galaxy, that word would never be forgotten. The Valorian hegemony still stood after all these years, smaller and less powerful than it had once been, but still mighty beyond measure. And the Empress, who had made the decision to leave humanity alone, was remembered as one of the wisest rulers in their long history. She had seen what others could not, that some spirits cannot be conquered, that some fires cannot be extinguished, that some species would rather burn than bow. And she had been wise enough to step aside and let history take its course. The galaxy was bigger now, more complex, more dangerous in some ways and more hopeful in others. And at the center of all that change stood a species that had arrived on the scene barely 2 centuries ago. They were young and brash and sometimes foolish, but they had reminded the galaxy of something important. Freedom was not a gift that others could give you. It was something you had to claim for yourself. No matter the cost, and once claimed, it was worth fighting for until the last star burned out and the universe itself went dark. This was the lesson of humanity, written in the blood of countless generations and carried forward into an endless future among the stars. This was their legacy, their gift to a galaxy that had forgotten what it meant to be truly free. And this was their story, still being written with every new world they